I don't know about you, but test is not a word that sounds really good to my ears. I've never enjoyed the experience of being tested. When I was in school, I always found my exams to be very nerve-wracking and anxiety-causing. When I was in university, the final exams would be held in the hockey arena in the springtime when the ice had gone out, and I would be sitting there in long rows along with hundreds of other people writing the final exams on which an entire year of study would hinge. And these exam proctors would be marching up and down the long aisles, and it seemed as though they were like prison guards waiting to haul you off to solitary confinement if you so much as looked away from your own paper. When I was a teenager, my parents' cars were both standard transmission. And I remember when I took my driver's test, I was so nervous that my foot was completely shaking on the clutch. And I have no idea to this day how I was able to drive the car like that. And not only was I, worried about the road and the other cars, but I was kind of wondering on whether the examiner realized how nervous I was. And so I tried to keep the vibrations from the knee down. I don't know if you have better or worse experiences of being tested, but I would like to suggest that we test ourselves with a couple of questions today. What good is our faith? And what good is the God in whom we put our faith? I read a few minutes ago from the book of Genesis, chapter 22, a very famous story, one of the most well-known and most discussed and debated stories in all of the Bible, known traditionally as the Akedah, which is Hebrew for binding. It's the binding, the binding, of course, of Abraham's son Isaac. The story began with God calling out to Abraham and God testing Abraham. God sent a message to Abraham saying, "Go and offer up your son Isaac as a sacrifice, as a burnt offering. Isaac, your only son, your beloved son." Of course, it's an incredible request, all the more incredible when we recall that sometime earlier in the narrative, God had first reached out to Abraham to begin the process of reconciling humanity to himself. God called to Abraham and said, "Go to the land that I will show you. Leave your family, your extended family, your kin, your homeland. Go to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. I will give you many descendants, and all the nations of the earth, in fact, will be blessed through you and through your many, many heirs." Well, Abraham and his wife Sarah, at the time that original call came, were already too old to have children of their own. They had never had any children, and now it was too late biologically. And so the initial call that came from God was a perplexing one, we can well imagine. But nonetheless, Abraham and Sarah trusted God. They went and did as God asked, even though they must not have been able to see any conceivable way for God's promise to come true. Sometime later, Abraham and Sarah conceived, and they bore a son who was Isaac. And we can only imagine the joy that they felt. Not only did they have at long last a child of their own, but they would have seen in this child the proof that God's promises were real, that the God who had reached out to them was real, and that God's promises could be counted on. Now, after all of that, Abraham must have wondered, I'm to give this son back? It's an incredible story on many levels. Now, of course, to our hearers, it sounds particularly bizarre and awful that Abraham would be asked to offer his son as a burnt offering. Now, I don't think there's anything I could say or anyone else could say that will fully satisfy all of the questions that any of us might have. But I would like to suggest this, that in the time of Abraham, some 4,000 years ago, the Canaanite people who lived in the Near Eastern region of the world had as part of their religious practice child sacrifice. So as awful as it is to us, it is a practice and a concept that would have been known to Abraham. And as awful as it would have sounded to him, it would have been at least plausible that the God who had reached out to him would ask this, because the gods of some of his neighbors were asking this of them. And it would have likely been a real question in his mind: is the God who is called out to me and into whom I have entered a relationship just like those other gods that I am already aware of? And so, as strange and awful a scenario as it is, it would have been perhaps a plausible one to Abraham in that time and in that place. And a lesson we can draw from it is that God tests us in ways that are unique and personal. I don't know if some of you have seen the movie Master and Commander. A wonderful movie. To me, it is a great movie in every way. It takes place about 200 years ago, and it tells the story mostly of the crew on a British Navy ship who are playing a kind of cat and mouse game with a French vessel in the South Pacific. And the ship's doctor on the British ship is a naturalist. He's interested in learning about science and discovering new species. And for some period of time in the movie, the little cat and mouse game is taking place in the area of the Galapagos Islands in the South Pacific, which are, and of course even then were well known for being home to numerous new and undiscovered species of all kinds of animal life. And the ship's doctor, it has been his life's dream to go and visit the Galapagos Islands, that he might be known of as a great naturalist, and he might discover some new species of animals that he could take back to Europe. And towards the end of the movie, the British ship is in need of repairs, and the crew is in need of some rest. And they decide to hide from the French in a little inlet in one of the Galapagos Islands, a little bay, and they're able to go ashore. And the doctor is given permission to go exploring. And he takes another person from the ship, and they're traveling all over the island, and they've got these cages of which they've discovered all kinds of never before seen by human eyes animals, birds and lizards and insects. And at one point they've scaled a hill, and the doctor lifts up his eyes, and he sees in a little inlet on the other side of the island the French ship. And his heart sinks. The actor who portrays it is a wonderful actor. You can see the look in his eye that his lifelong dream is about to come to an end almost as quickly as it started. God tests us in personal ways. Oftentimes, when one feels called by God to go and do something, it involves a sacrifice on that person's part. The person who is called to go and do something must give something else up. God very rarely offers us the scenario where we can have it all. God especially tests us in times of difficulty. In times when we will need a really strong faith, God sends a test to help us see what we're made of, how strong our faith really is. And almost always those tests come in ways that are unique to us and in ways that are deeply personal. So God tested Abraham, and the story goes on to show how Abraham, against all the odds, trusted God and followed. The narrator tells us that Abraham got up the next morning and gathered everything he needed. He saddled his donkey, he gathered some sticks to build a fire, he got a knife, he got a torch, a couple of his servants, called his son Isaac, and they set off on their journey. After 3 days, Abraham identified the place that God was showing him and instructed the two servants to wait at a distance with the donkey, and he went on with Isaac. And then Isaac asked, "Dad, I see the wood and the knife and the torch. Where's the animal for the sacrifice?" And Abraham answered, "My son, God will provide." And they carried on together. And for all intents and purposes, it looked as though Abraham was willing to carry out the instructions that God had given to test him. I think of that wonderful scene in the movie Master and Commander, where the actor shows this instant look of recognition. He knows the situation, he knows the decision to be made, he knows what must be done. He immediately orders his comrade to put down the cages and open the doors so that the animals can be let out and go free, and then they head back to the ship as quickly as they could go. It was painful, but he knew the decision that had to be made. He made it, and he put it into action. We have these friends that we used to know in Port Rowan, and around the same time that we were moving up to Barrie, they quit their jobs and sold their house and moved up to northern Ontario. I think they're about 90 minutes outside of Thunder Bay. Why did they do that? Well, they were at some function where they met somebody who worked in that part of northern Ontario with the natives of the area. They ran a camp, an outreach by which they tried to meet the basic needs of those folks who are living in poverty, and also to help them be more equipped to meet their own needs and to succeed in the workplace and in the modern economy. And as they were driving home, both our friends, they began to talk about what they had heard and learned, and both of them had felt God calling them to go up and share that work, to leave their lives and to go and live somewhere else. And so that's precisely what they did. Keep in mind that this was not a job that pays a salary. It was something that they decided to do, and they live almost hand to mouth, by the gifts of others. Last Christmas, they had visited their family in southern Ontario, and they stopped to see us on their way back north, and we had all kinds of bath towels that were given to us at our wedding that we just haven't even opened yet because we got so many bath towels. And so we gave them a box of bath towels, and that's sort of how they live. It's not how I would want to live. I don't imagine it's something that you would look forward to, but that's what they feel called to do by God, and so they do it. American Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann says of Abraham's role in this story, Abraham has turned from his own way to the way of God, a way which lies beyond his understanding, but upon which he is willing to act in concrete ways. So often, that's what it is to put our trust in God. To know a little of what God wants of us, but to not know fully. And to realize that we cannot know fully. To realize that even if we are to take one step, we do not know where the next step and the next step will lead, only that God is calling us to take that first step. And what's left to us is to make the decision. Will we follow or won't we? And once we've decided, to put that decision into action. A friend of mine puts it this way. He says, faith is not having a backup plan if God lets you down. So God called to Abraham, God tested Abraham. Abraham decided to trust and to follow. And the story brings itself to conclusion by showing that God provided and God renewed the promises that had already been made to Abraham. See, just as Abraham was about to carry through the instructions God had given, God called out and demanded that Abraham stop, and Abraham was only too glad to do so, of course. And immediately thereafter, God provided an animal for the sacrifice, a ram who was caught in a bush by the horns. You know, it's an interesting aspect of the way that this story is constructed from a literary perspective. The different elements of the narrative have an opposite. For each element in the beginning of the story, there is an element opposite at the end. And you can sort of tick off the opposite pieces of the story, 1, 1, 2, 2, and so on. And if you do that, you're left with only one statement: God will provide. And from a literary perspective, that is a clear structural indication of the main point the story is driving us to. God will provide. And of course, the very conclusion of the story is the renewal of God's promises. God says to Abraham, "You have been faithful, and I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as many as the grains of sand on the seashore." God will always provide along the way that God has called us to follow. I remember when I was early in my ministry, I think maybe Emily was a baby. It was maybe her first Christmas. We came to the end of the year and had no money left. We'd, of course, been able to pay our bills and everything, thankfully, but we had no money left. And in that month of December, the local funeral home called me for 5 funerals. Thankfully, they were not members of my church or anything like that. There were 5 families in the community who needed some help. And in my former community, the funeral home gave $100 to the minister for a funeral. Now, I don't think there has ever been another month where I did 5 funerals. And I was really tired. It took a lot out of me, in addition to the busy Advent Christmas season, to do these extra funerals. But sometimes funerals are like the closest thing a minister can get to overtime. And I don't mean to say that cynically. Because we don't do it for the money, but that allowed us to have Christmas, which we wouldn't have otherwise have had, especially with a new baby. Even before that, I remember when I was going through for the ministry, and some of you may or may not know how that goes, but there's a kind of a long process you have to do. In addition to pursuing your studies, you interview lots of times with denominational officials. And when I was very near the end of my program and I was close to being ordained, there was somebody in my presbytery at that time who failed to fill out a form on my behalf. It was a simple form, only a little bit of content and a signature needed. And the timing of his lack of action actually caused me to be delayed for an entire year to become ordained. And that meant that I could not take a permanent position, or a position that paid adequately, shall we say. And the entry-level salary for a United Church minister is, say, $50,000. And at the time I was so angry about this person could not even make the basic effort, despite numerous phone calls for me to fill out a simple form. And it took me a while to get over it. But amazingly enough, God still provided for me in different ways, but very well in that period. And it ended up working out quite well for me, I would say, in the long run. I was very fortunate to end up getting the position that I did a year later. And I would even say, it'd take me too long to explain, but if I had been ordained a year earlier, I likely would not have been able to come and be the minister here. And so it's worked out well for me, although some of you may go home cursing that imbecile. Couldn't fill out a simple form. God has given us, friends, creation to meet our needs. God provides for us along the way. And in faith, we can recognize that it is God's provision which sustains our lives. Testing is not always a good experience, but testing in the big picture is a good thing. Testing helps us to learn whether or not we have the knowledge or the skills to perform a particular task. Of course, the fear and anxiety that testing sometimes elicits is due to our own concern that maybe we are not up to it. Conversely, sometimes we are the ones who get to administer the tests because there is something we need to learn. Today we have tested ourselves with a couple of questions. What good is our faith? I suppose each of us can only answer that for ourselves. But I would like to say to you that each of us has it within us to trust God with our lives. God has given us our lives. And it is within us to give those lives over to the purposes of God. The second question is, what good is the God in whom we put our faith? It's a very often asked question in reflection on today's reading. What good is a God who would initiate a story of a father giving up his son as a sacrifice? Now, I don't know if you recognize in that phrase, as many Christians have done, a foreshadowing of the story of Jesus, in that God was the one who gave up the Son as a sacrifice to reconcile humankind to himself. In the end, Abraham was not asked to do that. He was asked to think about it, but he was never asked to do it. But God did do it, because God is faithful, because God provides. It's difficult to put our trust in someone or something, especially in our day and age when so often we hear of people in authority who've let us down in some way, or maybe someone in our own lives in whom we put our trust has let us down. But God will never let us down. If God has called us somewhere or to do something, God will provide. God has reached out to us. God has spoken to us in love. God has made promises. God has called us. God has promised to provide. God's word passes every test because God is faithful. And when we put our faith in God, so too can we and will we pass every test that is set before us. Thanks and praise be to God.